Ahoy hoy, I'm Planet Walk, and recently I stumbled across a video by Lauren Chen talking about how there are people that are just pretending to be LGBT. It's a topic that I've wanted to cover for a while because, firstly, it's a big thing that people are claiming, especially when it comes to trans people. And secondly, I think that there is a lot to be said about it, especially when it comes to how these ideas affect LGBT people. And also, it will give me an excuse to do something, so stick around for that.
Hey, Lauren here, continuing this channel's Pride Month celebration. I thought today we could look over some data that seems to suggest that a large portion of the young people who today call themselves LGBT aren't actually LGBT and instead are only identifying as such for political reasons.
Okay, that makes absolutely no sense. Why would you identify as LGBT for political reasons? Like, what political benefit do you get from identifying as LGBT? In fact, I'd argue that it would be worse for you politically if you identify as LGBT because a lot of people are homophobic or transphobic.
Or, of course, there is also always good old-fashioned attention seeking, which is really crazy because I feel like in the social media age we are living in, the best way to get attention is actually by putting out controversial, politically charged YouTube videos.
So here's the thing. She is kind of right with her self-awareness, but her self-awareness kind of negates her point. Because if LGBT people are just pretending to be LGBT to get attention, and a good way to get attention is to put out controversial YouTube videos, well, there's a logical conclusion from that. Lauren Chen doesn't actually believe the controversial stuff she says, she's just saying it to get attention. Obviously, just because someone does something to get attention, that doesn't mean that they are pretending, because that would mean that I'm actually a flat earther.
So we have this really great article published by Quillette called Progressivism, Sexuality, and Mental Illness by Eric Kaufman. And we're going to be going through some excerpts of it, but I highly suggest that you go and read it in its entirety.
So I've taken a look at the article, and right off the bat, you can tell that it's biased because the people that it mentions to present one side of the debate is Bill Maher, Abigail Shrier, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, fortunately, they did mention other people to present the other side of the debate, and it is far more numerous than that. It is progressives. You would think that they would point to an actual person that disagrees with Bill Maher, rather than just an amorphous group of people. Now, just because something is biased doesn't mean that it can't make valid points. I mean, I have my own biases, but no one would say that just because I'm biased, that means that everything I say about the shape of the earth is just wrong. But it is important to be aware of when you are reading something that is quite biased, especially when it asserts correlation as causation. The article does that, by the way.
And basically what this article does, and why I think is so interesting, is that it looks over different studies that compare the number of people who call themselves gay or bisexual versus the number of people who actually participate in gay relations. And spoiler alert, there is a big difference between the two.
But does it really matter if there's a difference between the two? Like, if someone calls themselves gay but is actually a raging heterosexual, there's really no harm being done there. But let's not forget the flip side, the people that call themselves straight but are actually Matt Powell.
As we have gone over before in previous videos, the LGBT community is seemingly exploding. And as Eric explains in his article, a recent Gallup survey found that roughly 21% of Gen Z Americans who have reached adulthood, those born between 1997 and 2003, identify as LGBT. That is nearly double the proportion of millennials who do so, while the gap widens even further when compared with older generations. Also, Abigail Shrier, meanwhile, reports a 1,000-fold increase in trans identification.
Now, as I said in my video about Bill Maher, this is very similar to what happened with left-handedness. And the article even says, other liberals view the rise as the product of increasing toleration similar to left-handedness, in which identification increases as stigmas are lifted and people come out of the closet. And I do think that explains why there are so many more LGBT people these days, because people feel more comfortable being themselves. I also think that there is an aspect of people that realize that they're gay because all of a sudden they now have a word to describe this thing that they've been feeling. And I think this is especially true for people that are bisexual, because a lot of people think that you've got to like men or you've got to like women, and you can't like both. Internalized biphobia is a very real thing.
That does not actually mean that there is a 1,000-fold increase of people doing things like taking hormones or going into surgery, even though that has increased a lot.
So I'm going to give Lauren some credit here, because we've finally got someone that actually knows a little bit of what they're talking about. Just because someone is trans doesn't mean they get hormones or surgery. In fact, I think that quite a few people that get hormones don't actually go on to get any surgery. Although there is a question of whether that is due to them being unable to get it or them just not wanting it.
And the reason for this is that a lot of the people who call themselves trans are actually just non-binary or gender fluid, and their transness doesn't actually require any transitioning, save for maybe, I don't know, a plaid shirt.
Wait, are plaid shirts gendered?
I have no idea. Get a better name, dickhead.
Or maybe putting on like combat boots and getting a short haircut. Basically what I'm referring to is trans trenders, people who call themselves trans pretty much because it's the cool thing to do.
So I know quite a few non-binary people, and it is one of them things where I wouldn't say that they're being trans simply because it's the cool thing to do. Especially seeing as for some of them, there were definitely some signs there before they came out, and for others, they do have dysphoria. Not everyone that has gender dysphoria has to get hormones. Sometimes it's as simple as just using a different name or different pronouns. And let's say that they are saying that they're trans just so that they seem cool. If they're not doing anything harmful, what does it matter? I think that one of the worst things that you could do is suspect that someone is not actually trans and just doing it for attention, and then act like they are not trans. Invalidating people isn't necessarily going to work out in the way that you expect or necessarily lead to the best outcomes, especially seeing as there is the fact that you yourself could be wrong about it.
Well, it turns out that a similar phenomenon is also happening with sexuality, i.e. people wanting to call themselves gay or bisexual or pansexual or whatever it may be so they can be part of the LGBT community, but meanwhile, if you actually look at their behavior, they are just straight, just like a transgender might actually just be a tomboy.
How do you know that they're straight though? By their behavior? Well, when I was growing up, I was told that my behavior was gay, so I must be gay. People were making assumptions about my sexuality that were incorrect. They don't know who I was attracted to.
As the article continues, a granular look at survey data on same-sex behavior and LGBT identity shows that identification is increasingly diverging from behavior. More importantly, those who adopt an LGBT identity but display conventionally heterosexual behavior are a growing and distinct group who lean, unsurprisingly, strongly to the left politically and experience considerably greater mental health problems than the rest of the population. By contrast, those who engage in same-sex behavior are more politically moderate and psychologically stable.
So there is a reason why LGBT people lean to the left, and that is because the left is way more accepting of LGBT people. The article does disagree with this, stating, "Has the LGBT identity spike made young people more liberal? No, the overall ideological and partisan balance among the under 30s has been relatively stable since 2008. If being LGBT causes someone to become liberal rather than the reverse, we should have seen a big shift to the left among young people." Now, they don't actually show any data in the article, but the data that I have seen suggests that young people are more left-leaning. This means that if people shift left due to their identity, it's not going to be as noticeable in young people. There is also the fact that if you're on the left, you probably feel more comfortable coming out.
And to be clear here, I'm not saying, and neither is the author of this article, that gay people or bisexual people don't exist.
Well, that's good, but let's see how well you understand bisexuality.
And what I find interesting is that as letters have been added to the LGBT community, like queerness, for example, the Q, this type of behavior has not only become more common, but it's actually become, acceptable. Like, you don't have to justify or explain how you're LGBT. You can just call yourself queer, even though you may be a female who only wants to date males. And it's like, you can't question that because you are part of the amorphous queer category.
So when it comes to the term queer, I generally find that it is used as a catch-all for LGBTQIA. It's actually a really good way to describe everyone rather than continuously adding more letters and making it more complicated. Now you might be wondering, well, if queer means LGBTQIA, what does the Q stand for? Now the Q sometimes does stand for queer, but it can also mean questioning, because sometimes people aren't sure of their sexual orientation. It can take a bit to figure it out because it can get quite complicated.
This is something that I at least have noticed quite a bit on social media among activists or celebrities, but now we actually have data to back up the fact that, yeah, a lot of these people who are calling themselves pansexual or whatever, they are actually just straight.
Well, no, the data doesn't actually back it up. What you are doing is you are looking at data and making a surface level reading of the data. That is what conspiracy theorists do. It's why they think that vaccines are causing autism.
As Eric explains, a growing share of LGBT identifiers engage in purely heterosexual behavior. Figure 1, drawn from the General Social Survey, shows that in 2008, about 5% of Americans under the age of 30 identified as LGBT, and a similar number had a same-sex partnership in that year. By 2021, though, the proportion identifying as LGBT had increased 11 points to 16.3%, but the share reporting same-sex relations had only risen 4 points to 8.6%. LGBT identity had become twice as prevalent as LGBT behavior.
Okay, so there is something that is going on here. What they have done is they have conflated the absence of same-sex relations with being purely heterosexual behavior. So this means that if you're a gay dude that finds other guys attractive, yet you haven't managed to get railed yet, then that would be considered purely heterosexual behavior. I also wonder, what exactly does same-sex relations actually mean? Like, if you're a guy and you've made out with a guy, like, is that same-sex relations? Because if it is, then there are a lot of people that would be considered straight that would fall under having had same-sex relations. So I really doubt that that would be considered. However, that's not purely heterosexual behavior by any stretch.
We do have some more telling figures to go over. As Kaufman continues, and I quote, "The trend toward greater LGBT identification has been particularly pronounced for young women, among whom there are 3 bisexuals for every lesbian in the 2018-21 period. Among young men, on the other hand, gays outnumber bisexuals, and the LGBT total is only half as large as it is for women. So the explosion in LGBT identification has happened way more among women than among men," which really is not surprising for several reasons.
Now, I would agree that it's not that surprising because there is a kind of fetishistic acceptance of lesbian and bisexual women. Because there are a lot of straight guys that would love to have a threesome. And if you're straight and the person that you want to have a threesome with is straight, well then getting a third person is going to be kind of tough. I've only really met one person that is agender, so agender people are not that common. So when it comes to women, bisexuality is very much accepted, especially by guys. But when it comes to men, sometimes it's shunned more than being gay. This is because often straight people don't really know anything about bisexuality. So whilst they may be okay with gay people, they may not be okay with being in a relationship with someone who's bisexual. It's really weird, I don't understand it. Are the straights okay? And the answer to that is of course no.
The first off being that women's sexuality is way more fluid and easily influenced by society than men's. And the reason why I say this is because a while ago, I actually did a video talking about nature versus nurture when it comes to same-sex attraction. And we looked over some studies that looked at twins where at least one of the twins was gay or bisexual. And you see, if being gay or bisexual was something in your genes and you were just born that way, what we would expect to see with twins, identical twins specifically, is that there would be 100% chance of both twins being gay or straight or bisexual, but as it turns out, that's not the case.
Okay, so that is not how any of that works. Like, your genetics are not the sole determining factor of whether you are gay or not. There are other things like hormones, for example. Hormones do affect your sexuality. I have known people that have been on hormones, and by taking those hormones, they had their sexuality affected. I have heard of cases where someone who was a gay dude became a lesbian. That's pretty wild to think about. There is also a region of the brain that seems to be affected by hormones, but this region of the brain also is quite correlative to what your sexuality is. I think people really underestimate the amount of a role that hormones play on humans. Now, that's not to say that society cannot influence your sexuality, but to just say that it's society, in my view, is extremely reductive.
You do have situations where one identical twin might be straight and another might be gay, indicating that nurture, at least for some people and to some extent, does affect sexuality. And what is really interesting is that having different sexual preferences among identical twins is actually way more common for women than it is for men, meaning that when it comes to sexual preferences, women's are more easily influenced by nurture than men.
So there are so many things that could be going on here, and I really think that it is erroneous to assume that it's just one thing thing or the other. One thing might be repression. Some people might not want to admit to themselves that they are gay or bisexual. There might also be the fact that, women are different to men when it comes to hormones. We know that. You can't argue against that. And the hormonal differences in question may lead to less heterosexuality. And lastly, there are the chemtrails and the 5G rays that could be turning them gay. I don't think it's as simple as they're seeing too many gays, therefore they're being turned gay. I think that it's a complex issue, and surface level readings of things aren't going to give you proper answers.
But the second thing is that because women more so than men tend to be left-leaning and progressive politics now are so pro-LGBT whatever, if progressive people are just saying that they're LGBT for attention or to seem marginalized or trendy or whatever it may be, it would make sense that this would happen more among women because more women are progressives.
Or maybe it's easier to come out as gay in progressive circles as well as, question your sexuality.
This is a really interesting part of the article. It reads that, furthermore, the GSS data show that bisexual women are the fastest growing category, accounting for a disproportionate share of the post-2010 rise. And a closer look at trends among female bisexuals in Figure 2 shows that an increasing share of them displayed conventional sexual behavior. In 2008 to 10, just 13% of female bisexuals said they only had male partners during the past 5 years. But by 2018, this was up to 53%, rising to 57% in 2021.
So why does it say past 5 years there? Like, if they had a female partner 6 years ago, that's not going to show up in the data. That seems like it might be some crucial information that is being left out there. But on a positive note, at least it's male-only partners this time instead of no female partners.
I.e., most young female bisexuals today are arguably LGBT in name only. Yeah, you heard that right, folks. This was not always the case, but today the term bisexual amongst young women has become so watered down that most of these young women who call themselves bi actually exclusively have male partners.
Or maybe, and this is a wild idea, but maybe the way that you understand bisexuality is different to how bisexual people understand bisexuality. Especially given that bisexuality doesn't necessarily mean what a lot of monosexual people tend to think that it means. But before I explain, I need to do something because it's going to help me explain this. So, I'm bi. So yes, I am going to be able to explain this from my own personal experience and also explain why I think these narratives are damaging from my own personal experience. So I have only ever had female partners, and so a lot of people would look at me and go, well, if you've only ever had female partners, that would make you straight. However, the people that you have been with have no bearing over who you find attractive. Like, we can't say that, oh, you've never been with a girl or you've never been with a guy, so therefore you aren't into guys or girls. No, you might be. You just never gotten the opportunity to actually do that. But then there is another reason why someone who is bisexual may have never had a partner of the same sex or gender. And that is because we don't find everybody equally attractive. You see, I do not find guys nearly as attractive as I find women. Yes, I have found some guys attractive, but I've found a lot more women attractive. And then there's also non-binary people who are often more attractive than men or women. So yes, you can be bisexual and have a preference. Just because you have a preference doesn't mean that you're not bisexual. Like, I find this guy attractive, but I do not find this guy attractive. I don't have to find all guys attractive to be bisexual. And I don't find all women attractive either. Although that's the thing that gets me cancelled, isn't it? Also, there is a difference between being able to tell that someone is hot and personally finding someone attractive. Like, there are guys that I can tell are hot, but I'm not attracted to them, even if I did make out with one. Now, to be fair, the amount of guys that I find attractive, especially compared to the amount of women that I find attractive, is quite small. So a label like hetero-flexible might be a little bit more apt. But I'd consider hetero-flexibility a form of bisexuality. It's just a very skewed version of bisexuality. And sometimes I've wondered, can I really call myself bisexual? Which is really the whole issue with trying to question people's sexuality here. Sometimes it leads to a sort of imposter syndrome because, yeah, you're bisexual, but everyone's telling you that you're not bisexual enough, so maybe you should stop calling yourself bisexual. For a long time, I would call myself bisexual on a technicality because it didn't seem right to call myself bisexual when it was so heavily skewed. And a large part of why I didn't feel that it was right is because there are those connotations where it's like, oh, you're bisexual? Well, you haven't been with any guys then, so you must not really be bisexual. When that is what a lot of people think of bisexuality, it becomes very difficult to break out of that mindset. And it doesn't help that you've got people like Chen that will come along and say, well, these people have never been with someone of the same sex or gender, so they must be pretending to be bisexual. No, I know who I'm attracted to. So if you want to sit there and say, well, you've never been with a guy, so you're not truly bisexual, then fuck you.
Which is really not a surprise for anyone who's been around young white women, or specifically young white women in college. So many of them call themselves bisexual, and it really is seemingly, if not politically motivated, then just attention motivated. It's a way to set yourself out from the crowd. Because, being a woman, it's really not that marginalizing nowadays, depending on the news cycle. It's a little bit different if we're talking about things like Roe versus Wade. But for a lot of these young women, I think you got to go the extra mile, and being bisexual, or at least calling yourself that, is a great way to get those oppression points without actually having to change anything about your behavior at all.
Why does everything have to be about, oh, you're just doing this because you want to feel oppressed? No, I don't want to feel oppressed, in fact. Feeling oppressed feels pretty bad. There is a reason why I'm happy about certain pale aspects of myself, because I like not being oppressed. If I wanted to feel oppressed, I'd subscribe to all these channels that say that our masculinity is under attack or something like that. Then I'd get to feel oppressed without actually being oppressed. It's way better than joining a group where you might actually be oppressed if you're a part of that group.
According to the GSS, the LGBT share rose from 11 to 34% between 2008 and 2021 among very liberal young people, which is a 23% increase, huge, but the share increased from only 3 to 9% among the slightly liberal, moderate, or conservative, who make up around 4/5 of the total. So this explosion of LGBT identifiers, this really is a left-wing phenomenon. This is not something that's happening everywhere across the political spectrum.
So I've already addressed this, but there is a graph that she has left out. I'm not going to show it yet. I'm going to let her finish her argument, but this graph has a lot more information, let's say. And it is very telling that the article focused on one particular section of the graph rather than the entire thing.
Which is interesting, because we so often hear from the left that the reason why more people are calling themselves LGBT isn't because it's trendy or they're being indoctrinated to do so. It's because society is more accepting, and people who have always been LGBT, they simply feel more comfortable coming out about it now. But if that were the case, you would expect to see at the very least comparable or similar increases in LGBT identifying amongst the slightly liberal or independent. But you just don't, even though we are all living in the same society.
So here is the graph that I'm talking about. Now, to be fair, it just shows 2020 to 2021, but that's all I need to really make the point that it omitted some information earlier on in the article right here. So up here it mentions the GSS, and we can see that that is the grey bars on this graph. And the sample size for it is 231. We can see that going just under the graph. That's an okay sample size, I guess. However, it's not as reliable as a sample size of, let's say, 13,000 or 56,000. So why point out something about a survey that has a tiny sample size compared to the other surveys? I can understand maybe not talking about the FIRE one in depth, because I think that was just a student survey, so you might get some skewed results there. But for the CCES, that has a sample size of 13,000. So the data there is going to be far more reliable. And the reason why I bring this up is because the studies with the higher sample size show that, yeah, as you're more liberal, you're more likely to be LGBT. But it's not just if you're very liberal. It's if you're slightly liberal as well. Or if you're moderate, you're more likely to be LGBT than if you're conservative. And Chen just seemed to completely ignore that graph, acting as though there has been very little rise of LGBT people within slightly liberal people. I swear that sometimes people don't actually know how to read the things that they are reading. Somehow they've managed to read one part, but they've just completely ignored everything else.
Minority liberal students are much less likely to identify as LGBT, and political views matter much less for them in predicting LGBT identity. But among young people without a college degree, minorities are as likely as whites to identify as not heterosexual. So obviously, if being gay or straight or bisexual were just something innate, you would expect that we would see similar rates among all the different races. And it turns out that among people who haven't gone to college, that is true. You're about as likely to be gay or straight or bi or whatever it is, whether you're white or black. However, it turns out that is not the case if you have been to college. Simply put, white students are disproportionately more likely than black students to call themselves LGBT. So why might this be? Well, if you ask me, it's because a black student, well, they already have a pretty good trump card when it comes to the oppression pyramid. I mean, BLM, it's a big thing. Being black when it comes to, I don't know, claiming liberal victimhood, but the same is not true for white people.
So that is a good question to ask, one that I personally don't have the answer to. But I don't think that it's about oppression. I really don't think that the reason why people are saying that they're LGBT is because they want to feel oppressed. Having spoken to several queer people myself, a lot of people, even though they may not have had same-sex relations or same-gender relations, they may have made out with someone of the same sex or gender. And I have met, I think, one person that was like that, but then later decided that they were straight. But they certainly weren't pretending to be bi for oppression points. They just didn't really know who they were attracted to, but later figured it out. Some people are like that. I think that it's just wild to assert that a lot of people are doing it for oppression points. Yes, a few people might be. You do get some weird people that want to be oppressed, but I think that the majority of people, you know, legitimately are attracted to who they say that they're attracted to. But anyway, leave a like and subscribe if you like this video. Leave your thoughts down in the comments. I think I'm bound to get some interesting comments for this video. As always, a big shout out to my $20 or more patrons: Hugh Jarsz, M.C.Nutkin, SHaKie, Jett Alone, Wolfie, Morrie, Graymore Ghost, KidVicious, Sacha Campbell, Militant Agnostic, Kitten, McKitten from Kitten Town, Craig D'Amelio, Nurthen Thurmpson, and Richard M Chapman. If you want to support me financially, you can do so on Patreon. There should be a link there. But anyway, I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.